Welcome to the third edition of the Daily Action Book Club. My name is Benjamin Moser, and I'm joined by Rebecca Solnit, who is the author of Hope in the Dark, Untold Histories, Wild Possibilities. Welcome to you, Rebecca, and welcome to everyone who is joining us. If you're here for the first time, I'd like to just say a couple of things about the Daily Action Book Club. After the election in November, so many of us wanted to know what we could do. And one of those people was my sister, who is Laura Moser, who came up with a way to do something to help us channel some of this anxiety and fear that we were feeling every single day. And what it is you text the word daily to the number 228466, which spells action, ACTION. You'll receive one text message every day about an urgent issue. You click on the link that you'll get on your phone and you'll get a little explanation, and then you'll get routed automatically to your senator, congressman, or other relevant person. And it takes 90 seconds and you've done it. So that is what you can do every day. The book club wanted to go a step further and ask how this could happen to our country. And we wanted to understand our country better. We wanted to learn about its challenges, and we wanted to also kind of go back in history and see how Americans had faced these kinds of problems in the past. So we were thrilled to have to be able to invite Rebecca Solnit because she gives the historical perspective that we need. I mean, we've always had these bad politicians, we've always had corruption and lies and everything that's so unpleasant now, but we've also had something else that has become even more important now, and that's the will to fight back and to keep on fighting back, even at times like this. So Hope in the Dark was written a few years ago, but it's a book that has only grown more relevant as people have increasingly turned to Rebecca. I hope I don't embarrass you by saying this, but Rebecca has really become somebody that we look to, we look up to, we depend on you to tell us what's going on, because so much is happening and we don't really have a chance to digest it. So thank you so much for joining us. And my first question is a little bit of a personal question, but I think that a lot of people will be able to identify with it. Sometimes you don't want to look at your phone, you don't want to look at the newspaper, you just want it to all go away. And it's like being a little kid. You want your mommy to come just make it stop. And I wanted to know, how do you distinguish between this kind of wishful thinking or fantasy and the positive hope that things can change, that it's not going to last forever, that we can keep going, that we can fight back?
One thing that's been fundamental to my idea of hope is that hope is a sense of uncertainty. It's not wishful thinking, and it's really, really not optimism. Optimism is everything's going to be fine, and therefore we don't have to do anything. And it's actually the sort of mirror image of pessimism, which is that everything inevitably sucks, and therefore we don't have to do anything. Hope is really coming to terms with a sense of absolute uncertainty about the future, that we don't know what's going to happen, but some of it is up to us. I've really been preoccupied this year by the realization that, because people keep talking about, like, well, how's this going to play out? And I keep saying, we don't know because it's up to us. If people believe we can change this country, we can have a progressive revolution, that's foundational to actually doing it. If people don't, if they believe it and then they act on it, and getting people to believe it is kind of the first step. I totally hear that sense of, like, this is so sucky, I need a break from it. And I'm a big fan of what I think of as sustainable activism. My activist career began in the early 80s with watching the nuclear freeze movement, which was people who thought we're going to achieve everything we needed within a few years, and when they or even more quickly, and when they didn't get it all done immediately, they thought, like, well, then it didn't work, which is like saying, I planted seeds yesterday, there aren't any trees today. Like, this growing orchard stuff is not what I thought it would be. So and part of the uncertainty I'm interested in is what you could call, there's a collateral damage, which is a horrible euphemism for, unintentional killings, civilian killings in wars. And there's a kind of collateral benefit of unintended consequences, positive results that are not necessarily what people set out to do, things unfolding over the long term. I think we're in an emergency, and resisting it with all our might matters. But I think we got here really through neglect. We're not a country where the majority of people support what Trump stands for. We're a country where way too many people didn't participate in the system until the system was so corroded that, we had massive voter suppression. We had this kind of fake news and fake choices and fake framing of the situation. And, it can all be changed, but you do have to face it. And then the last thing in this very long answer to the question is, I also think that there's often a sense of like, I'll feel better if I hide from all these bad things. And again, I think sustainable activism means going and doing really fun things some of the time, and spending time with kids or whatever kind of changes the topic for you. But I actually think facing things and trying to do something about things really makes you feel much better about those things. During the 1980s, pretending that nuclear weapons didn't exist didn't really take away the dread of nuclear Armageddon. Going to the Nevada test site, for me, where our nuclear weapons were tested, and protesting with people from around the world, did actually, and I didn't do it to feel better. I did it to try and stop the nuclear arms race, and et cetera. And I think that there's also something very sustaining about facing it, particularly when you find the kind of beloved community, to use a Martin Luther King term, in doing so. And I think that the beloved community is there in this resistance that's arisen.
That's a great phrase. It's a new one for me. I wondered, this book, just to follow up, a little bit, this book was written at a different time. I mean, people did not feel any more powerful than they do now. It's the time of the Iraq War and the Bush administration. How do you think that these lessons apply to the Trump administration and to the current regime? And how do you think this time is similar or different to that time?
I was terrified after the election that it was going to feel like post 9/11 America. And I've been thrilled that it doesn't. What happened after 9/11 is that they're able to use patriotic rhetoric, or kind of transform the attack by the 19 hijackers into, the global war on terror, and to intimidate people into a kind of a sense that blind obedience was the same thing as patriotism. I think a lot of people were terrified, and with reason. When I went to Camp Casey outside Bush's ranch in Texas, I met people who had been fired from their teaching jobs for saying things against the war and stuff like that. I was worried people would be too afraid to stand up. And what's been beautiful is a kind of fearless, spit in your eye, a cat may look at a king kind of attitude. Every time Trump tweets something, hundreds of Americans are there to say, you're wrong, you're a liar, you're a loser, we hate you, we want to see the back of you. Not playing golf back of you, mind you, but like the door swinging to hit you on the way out back of you. And, and so that feels different. What doesn't feel different is a sense of the country heading in an incredibly destructive direction. Well, under the leadership of a bunch of conservatives who are not even conservative, but who are kind of the radical right, pursuing a deeply destructive agenda for the environment, for human rights, for the majority of people in this country, for the long-term future of international relations in the world, for truth and accuracy in language. And I think there was some beautiful and amazing resistance in 2000 and, after 2001 that really mattered, from solidarity with Muslim people who were being targeted then as they are now, to anti-war activism. But it didn't feel broad and deep and strong the way this does. So I think even though we're in some ways, the worst crisis in this country's history, we've never had a president who's this reckless, insane, disrespectful of the rule of law, etc., and backed by dark money and sort of elite agendas. We could argue about the details. There is, one of the things I think that people can feel good about is that there is this resistance, and being part of it might be part of feeling good, good about it and strengthening it and counting it. There's people like the woman putting out small victories, this project you're part of, that I think do a really good job also of saying, like, here's where we have levers, here's where we have victories, here's where we can have victories, here's where we can make a difference. I love it that activists are looking at 2018 and laying the groundwork for taking back Congress, and that people are really kind of digging in, also with the sense that this isn't like we're either going to stop the war or we lost, which is the simple analysis that launched me on this book. But I'm really looking at, like, okay, we need to shift the balance of power. We need to build something new. We need to be in this for the long run, and they are, and that's exciting.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, at Daily Action, we have tried to focus on the many little victories that we have scored,
Yeah.
and we have scored quite a few. But it feels exciting on Tuesday, and then on Wednesday something else happens. And are you not optimistic? I was going to say optimistic, but hopeful that these victories aren't just tokens, and that they are going to add up, even despite all of the things that are happening on the other side that seem to undermine any progress that's made.
I've never felt. In a way, I almost feel the word hope now feels too tied to positivity,
Right.
and uncertainty almost feels like the key word for me. I've never felt more we don't know what's going to happen next. Are they going to try and suspend the Constitution and impose, and stage a coup, as the firing of Comey seems to suggest, that getting rid of anyone independent who doesn't swear loyalty, who tries to, hold us to the rule of law with investigations, checks on executive power, etc. But I've also, there's something about the Trump administration also that's very precarious. They're incompetent, they're widely despised, including by a lot of career civil servants. They keep violating the law, they're clearly lying. And he's the most unpopular president at this point ever. There's enormous possibility. I don't have any sense of what could happen. I do think we're a big insubordinate country. There are countries where you can impose martial law and intimidate everyone. I don't think you can do that here because, I think people on the right with all their weapons are not real into that. Many of them are not into that. But we're so big, and and the entire California state government is opposed to the Trump administration. You're not going to subjugate California and the Ninth Circuit. You're not. I don't think they can do that. And part of what's been fascinating to me is it all feels like an education in the nature of power. Trump thinks that his power is coercive, but the real power, which, harking all the way back to the Obama era, you can see is that presidential power is really cooperative. You follow the rules, you treat the legislative and the judiciary and the public with some modicum of respect. Because the only power that the executive branch has is to give orders, and that's only power if they're obeyed. And we've seen the judiciary through Sally Yates and the court rulings on the Muslim ban and et cetera say, well, no, that's not going to fly. We've seen a lot of kinds of resistance in a lot of places. And there's a funny way, I keep thinking of Trump and his team as being like the Bundys holed up at the Malheur Wildlife Refuge, where it's like, yeah, they've got a federal building, and they're holding it for now, this bunch of angry white guys, but they're not necessarily, they're not necessarily going to win. But I feel like it's all up to us, and I feel like my role has been to remind people we have a history of victory. Civil society is tremendously powerful. And what happens is not about passively sitting back like it's a football game or the weather, things that, we're not participants in. It's recognizing that this is one of the deepest emergencies this country has faced, and civil society in many ways is the great counterweight to executive power, and that by being insistent through the kinds of measures your organization does, all of you listening do that are, through protests, through how we frame the conversation, through refusing to let them frame it in ways that, make truth lies and lies truth, and, trying to think of the 1984, war as peace kind of language. Yeah. That, understanding our power and exercising it is how we might determine the outcome, which is absolutely uncertain now. But I think it could be, it could be a long, terrible era, but it could also very quickly turn into a huge shift in the other direction. And so much of my hope before the election was pinned on the fact that half the people in this country under 18 are not white. The Republicans have committed themselves to be the party of white grievance, white resentment. And, they have almost no support from people of color overall. And the future, the only way they've hung on to power is through gerrymandering, voter suppression, and making this country less and less democratic. Just the process of making this country more participatory and democratic almost inevitably weakens them. And if we had free and fair elections, if we have them in 2020, Republicans will never be able to win a national election again. And that's kind of exciting. I think having a voting rights movement like the 1960s, needs to be part of the long term. And I do see people doing that both with lawsuits around voting rights, voter ID laws, cross-check, voter suppression. And of course, Trump's pretending that there's lots of voter fraud, which is the Republican justification for preventing people from voting. So I think that's one of our battles, but I think we've seen a number of significant victories. I think it's today the Supreme Court refused to review a North Carolina law that I think the circuit court or federal court that reviewed it said couldn't be more perfectly designed to, prevent black voting. So, and the nakedness of that destruction of democracy to hold on to power is part of the absolutely amoral ugliness. And the more we make that visible, which is also part of the work, the more we make people understand they won the election by preventing probably tens of millions of people from their voting rights. The more we move forward in the direction we need to
go. My sister, Laura Moser, who founded Daily Action, and then when it took off, she felt a responsibility to do even more, and now she's running for Congress in Texas, and that's great, but not everybody can found a big political organization or run for Congress. And I wonder if, in your own life, have you been able to find a balance between your activism and your writing and your existence as a normal person? How much activism should we be striving for? And when do we know if we're doing enough just as individuals?
I don't have an answer for that. And, everybody has a different capacity. And, if you're a single mom with 3 kids and 3 jobs, you're in a different position than if you're like, a single person with a trust fund. If you're, in a deep red state, you might be different than if you're in Brooklyn and what you can do. And you might be able to do more in the red state, actually. There's some beautiful activism now from North Carolina to Nebraska, North Dakota, and etc. But, it's really, and I think it's also, I think, balance. It's funny because I've never found a life-work balance.
Nobody has.
It's such a weird word because it suggests stability, first of all, and this week isn't like last week. I spent just November and December, like a week after the election, I realized it might be possible to stop Trump before the inauguration, and I'm going to give it everything I can. And I work with some really great scholars and activists to try bring the Russia stuff to light. As you know, I saw it then, and it's been interesting feeling somewhat vindicated as probably not necessarily the worst thing about them, the most illicit thing about the election, since I just talked about voter suppression, but possibly the 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 place where we can apply a lever to pry them loose from power, to prove kind of illegitimacy and corruption. So, and to also go after, to support the impeachment and emoluments lawsuits and things like that. And so it wasn't sustainable. I was like, okay, I will do this intensely for 2 months. And it is, I think one of the questions we have to ask ourselves, which I also asked myself in the Bush era, is like, what would you have done during the rise of the Third Reich? Because we're all like, why were those Germans planting their tulips and, going to, concerts when the Nazis were consolidating power? And it's like, part of it is a lot of people didn't notice because they weren't paying attention. And normal life has a really strong pull. And I've seen, and it's not to say like everyone should drop everything and eventually, lose their home because they stopped working for, at their job and or teaching their students or seeing their patients. But I think that there is a kind of, we're on a war footing, this is an emergency sense that might make people step up more with the sense that right now it matters immensely. And I think the administration, it sort of falls apart in front of us all the time, and that there's a lot of leverage to keep pushing, widening those cracks. And so if you ever thought, what would I have done during the rise of the Third Reich? What would I have done, when these terrible things were happening? What would I have done during the abolition movement? Would I have harbored runaway slaves? Would I have supported John Brown? Would I have been part of the Concord Ladies Anti-Slavery Society, or whatever, comes to mind? Like, this is one of those moments. This is not a normal times. I think that we're all citizens, which for me isn't a term about whether or not you have citizenship, whether you're documented, but we belong to, we're members of civil society, we're participants, and we participate by our passivity and our indifference. That's a choice, just as we participate by our activism and our passionate concern.
So
and I do feel this is a moment for people to step up a little bit more, but it's, and sometimes it makes sense where it's like, I'm going to go to Washington and do this intense thing for this 1 week, or I'm going to save up so I can work really hard on the midterm elections and build towards those, or like I can do this one Saturday a month with my group, sending postcards or doing voter registration. I think it's, I don't have a one size fits all answer, but I do think it's an emergency.
One of the things that you've described in Hope in the Dark that I think is very relevant today, and I think it's different from the Bush anti-war movement, but you described how media coverage has often mocked resistance movements and, sort of belittled them until they became successful, at which point everybody loved them and they were inspiring and heroic and all that. Do you think it's different this time? Is that just my impression? I mean, how have resistance movements been taken more seriously? And really importantly for activists, how can we as individuals who might not have a platform that you have or that I have, how could regular people help influence media coverage and draw attention to things that are happening in their communities?
Everyone has a voice and a place to use it, I think. And how can ordinary people do that? And I think you're right, and I think it's actually kind of great that the resistance now is getting a lot more respect than we saw with like Occupy Wall Street.
It feels that way.
Yeah, and of course there's that famous line I think I used in the book that's been ascribed to Gandhi, but it doesn't seem to be accurately from him. But that's like first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. And And part of what I think has happened is that, and what gets called the 60s, I think happened partly because the media was very sympathetic to dissent about the war, and they, and so, not always, but they often kind of, the civil rights movement and anti-war movement got at least pretty fairly treated a lot of times by the mainstream media, whether it was Walter Cronkite on CBS News or the big newspapers and some of the small stuff. And the anti-war movements, environmental movements, human rights movements have often been mocked since then as seen as 60s throwbacks or as ridiculous or whiny, or there's a lot of ways to dismiss people. And it's been kind of exciting that this isn't taken that way. And I think it's partly because the media itself is a little shocked and horrified by Trump, partly because this is a really broad-based mainstream movement that started really big with the Women's March. 4.5 million people or 5 million people, as Erica Chenoweth and her associates counted after the march, can't really be dismissed as some kind of trivial rabble. And, so I think that writing to the newspaper when they let the arguments be framed in corrupted ways, like I love the blowback the New York Times got for publishing a kind of merchant of doubt, climate denier, new columnist. People resigned their subscriptions and protested intensely, let them know this is not okay. I think whether it's the comment sections, letters to the editor, which do get read even when they don't get published, calling into radio stations, that there's a lot of different ways for people to participate. People use social media to circulate to their community. This march is happening. It's really important to let our congressperson know that we feel strongly about reproductive rights or healthcare or, or immigrants' rights or things like, there's a lot of different ways. And being part of the group is also, civil society is the power we have together. And, it's actually been beautiful as somebody's participated in a lot of kind of marches and uprisings to see people at Standing Rock, at Occupy, at, the great global anti-war moment in 2002, to see people find that sense of power and voice and being part, not their individual voice, but the voice they have by being part of the group as well. That also matters. And even though I'm a writer and I have a platform, to be part of that group matters to me too. It's a profound and moving and powerful thing.
It's interesting you mentioned social media because I hadn't actually
Yeah.
thought about it in the context of interviewing you and about this book, but it's actually something that's very different from the days of the Iraq War movement. So, I mean, that is something that I think people are reaching out in more, in broader ways. It's everybody can see what you think about things, which is often thousands of people. So,
and there's a lot of ways, people recirculate things and make them very visible. And in times something really important appears in a smaller magazine, Mother Jones or something like that, and it gets huge traction and it helps.
And everybody sees it.
The issue, and that and so we're all amplifiers now, and that's what social media has given us. And we've seen with women's rights and Black Lives Matter in particular, how people have been able to formulate messages together. And the Black Lives Matter is a phrase that was put out on Twitter by Alicia Garza that became a huge movement that, at least before this election, was bringing national awareness to police brutality and police murder, forcing cities to deal differently with these things, to acknowledge the problem, to prosecute murderous policemen. For example, women were able to use hashtags like Yes All Women, I believe her, to refuse to let the old misogynist framing of sexual violence, as blame the victim, don't believe her, etc., prevail. And it's really made a difference the way that like campus anti-rape organizing has, and a lot of these other things. There's a lot of power that happens in small groups and in social media. Yes All Women, the hashtag that came out right after the Isla Vista massacre. Right, just this month, was it only 3 years ago? It seems like a long time ago.
Everything seems like a long time
Or
ago.
4 years ago. I know everything before
Everything
November 8th.
before
It's a
Trump seems
nightmare.
like, yeah.
T.
Can I want to ask you just one more of my questions.
Let me just
Oh,
say
sorry.
one more thing. I just want to say the hashtag Yes All Women, which just went incredibly viral, as we say now, was coined by a young Muslim woman who was then so persecuted by misogynist men on Twitter, which is something Twitter is very good at not preventing. She went silent for months, but Yes All Women became an organizing cry for women to talk about how widespread this violence is and how unacceptable, and really reframe the story. And that was, and part of my hopefulness is you never know when you're going to be that one person, who, and the literal depiction image we have of it is that beautiful woman defying the police last summer at a Black Lives Matter demonstration, or, the lone Chinese person defying the Chinese tanks during Tiananmen Square. But also you might be the person who coins the hashtag, who inspires someone to take action, who makes a congressperson wake up and realize they need to filibuster. And you don't know what the consequences of your actions do. And so there's a way people often say, like, well, I can't change the world, so I won't try to change the world. And if you don't try, you definitely won't. But if you do try, sometimes remarkable things happen, these sort of chain reactions and cascading consequences that are just remarkable.
Well, that's what's so exciting about your book. It's got so many examples of that happening and people not knowing that it's going to happen. But I want to just ask one more of my questions, then I want to go to the questions from our members, which is, as someone who writes and travels and speaks about activism and who is connected to so many people, and somebody, that frankly a lot of people look to kind of know what to think and know what to do. I just wanted to ask you if there's any movements or that we should join or that we should contribute time or money to, or any political leaders that you find inspiring and that we should pay more attention to, or any ideas that we as members of the resistance ought to be looking to. I mean, what can you report to us about those people and those ideas?
God, it's hard to feel prepared enough for this because there's so much going on.
Yeah.
And the Black Congressional Conscience the Black Congressional Caucus continues to feel like the keeper of the nation's conscience, and as a group take remarkable stands. There are a lot of Democrats who've kind of found their backbone, and of course a lot who did have backbones, Elizabeth Warren and Al Franken, and there's a lot of people to watch doing great things now. There's a lot of people organizing a lot of levels. The climate and environmental movement continues to have really fantastic leadership with people like Nate Bove and Leonard, respectively at 350.org and Greenpeace. Feminism continues to fight the Trump administration. And there's so many pieces of it. What I sometimes feel is missing is a clear enough articulation of what does all this have in common? What do these rights that sometimes get dismissed as identity politics, rights for people of color, for queer people, for women, for the disabled, for the elderly, for children, for immigrants, for religious minorities, have in common with, as well with environmentalism, with addressing climate, with human rights abroad, with anti-war. And so I feel like, and something I'm going to try and do in the near future is to try and articulate in a way I hope will be useful what those common denominators are. But, there's people like Jane Cleave at Bold, Nebraska, who's now the chair of the Nebraska Democratic Party, doing gorgeous things. There's so many people on so many levels, from local democratic and, other kinds of organizing to the national scale. There's also a lot of great writing happening now around how activism works.
Is there anyone you would point to that you yourself, because we're looking to you, but who have you been looking to
oh my God,
to help you think?
I can picture the books. I did find L.A. Kaufman's book Direct Action really exciting, and I wrote about it in The Guardian recently. Can I tell a story?
Yeah,
this is like one of the most wonderful stories recently, and it's a story about how change works. A little group called the Clamshell Alliance formed in the mid-1970s to stop a nuclear power plant from being built in New Hampshire, and you could tell the story one way, which is but which is, well, they did all this great organizing. They didn't stop the nuclear power plant. And that's how we get told stories by the mainstream media of activism. Did you stop the war? Did you prevent this person from getting elected? The Clamshell Alliance did not stop the nuclear power plant. They did, however, formulate strategies, tactics, ideologies, build a toolbox. You could even say have a vision of a more compassionate, inclusive, egalitarian way of organizing political activism and direct action. That is how all of us do it now, how we do it at Standing Rock, how we did it at Occupy Wall Street, how we did it in the anti-war movement. And so they get, and so they have this, and they also inspired more than 100 anti-nuclear movements around the country that prevent, or that's not the right way to say it, is they prevented more than 100 nuclear power projects from going forward. They changed the world essentially. If you can tell the story of indirect consequences, you can see that they were tremendously effective and powerful, so powerful that they became part of the very fabric of what American activism is. And L.A. Kaufman tells that story, and it's so beautiful, and it's about the necessity of understanding often our actions will not be what we intend, but they'll matter and be important and transformative anyway. Often change doesn't happen in direct ways, but
Can you
it
tell us the
happens in
title
ways that
one more
almost
time?
more forwards.
I'm sorry,
Okay,
can you repeat the title one more time?
it's called Direct Action,
Direct Action.
L.A. Kaufman, and it's a history of activism in the U.S. since the 1960s. And we've heard almost too much about the 60s, not enough about what's happened since.
Well, it sounds great. I haven't read it, but it sounds really like something we ought to do here at the book club.
You know what? Mark and Paul Engler have a great book called This Is an Uprising, about how organizing actually works to affect change, that I think is a really exciting book. And there's been a real blooming of books about how do you do it. Becky Bond, who was part of Bernie Sanders' team, did a book recently, which I haven't read yet, but I'm looking forward to getting into. The Reverend William Barber III, who's organized the Moral Mondays in North Carolina, wrote a book called The Third Reconstruction about the kind of activism he's doing, uniting economic and racial justice, and really tapping into that kind of beautiful religious beloved community organizing that the civil rights movement did in what he might call the Second Reconstruction.
Okay,
And,
we have had lots of response from our Daily Action members, and I just like to throw you some of their questions that we've selected. The first one we have is from Barbarina from Montpelier, Vermont. And this is another mental health question. I think you could classify these. As you know, a lot of people are having a tough time. She says, what is helping Rebecca stay hopeful amidst the daily assaults on our democracy and various groups, programs, and institutions?
Part of it is really counting the victories we're having now, and part of it is remembering the past. The future is unknowable. That's what that uncertainty I keep talking about is all about. But I look at countries like, one of the remarkable stories that wasn't told nearly enough in the Bush era is that in the 1980s and into the 1990s, a lot of South American countries were dictatorships run by death squads, torture and a complete suppression of human rights. Even mass murders were carried out to, further these incredibly destructive agendas. And that didn't last forever. Nothing, I'm old enough to remember the collapse of Eastern European communism, the East Bloc, and then the Soviet Union. And there was one beautiful procession, a photograph in the newspaper I can still have all those years later, of a man carrying a statue of Lenin, and it said in Czech, which I will mispronounce, Nic netra vekni, nothing lasts forever. I think when I think about the Mexico, trauma at the hands of the drug cartels, it won't last. How will it end? We're writing that story ourselves
Hmm.
because it is not yet written. But I also go back to look at these tremendous transformations we've had in our lifetimes. And I'm old enough. I was born at the beginning of the '60s. I was born into a world in which there was no racial equality, there was no gender equality. Queer people were routinely persecuted as mentally ill or criminal or both. We didn't even have language for things like workplace sexual harassment, marital rape, date rape, and homophobia. We didn't have a language for the environment, and we weren't doing anything to protect it. We have changed so much, and when you see how deep and strong those changes are, how in some ways this country has become much more diverse and accepting of diversity of every kind, and much more anti-authoritarian. We tolerate it in education and workplaces and marriages and families and personal relationships, much more hierarchy and authoritarianism than we do now, and kind of blind obedience. The revolutions of the '60s, which I think of as the civil rights movement, the environmental movement, the women's movement, gay and lesbian rights, as well as the '60s, white kids protesting the war and their allies. It never ended. We've been in an unending revolution to redefine everything, and right now, the backlash against it to give all power back to essentially white Protestant heterosexual patriarchy, has won some really big victories, but I don't think they can win in the long run because they are a minority and they can't make the genie go back in the bottle. They can't make us think women shouldn't have jurisdiction over their own bodies again. They can't make us think marriage should be an unequal relationship in which husbands are the boss and that only heterosexual couples should have access to it. They can't make enough of us think that people of color don't deserve to be treated as equal. And, they can't make us forget that what we do has environmental consequences. They haven't lied enough to make the world, disbelieve in the urgency of climate change. And so in a lot of ways, we are winning. And the long arc of history, there's Martin Luther King, the arc of history curves towards justice. And there's a lot of curves in there, and they're curving in a lot of directions. But some of them are curving towards a more aware, more inclusive, more systemic imagination in each of us that doesn't tolerate the sheer bullshit in this kind of there is no environment, we don't need the EPA, there's no consequences to burning coal, same-sex marriage oppresses, religious freedom. People aren't, I think something that's key, and there's some organizations, great new organization, I forget exactly its name, but it's about the fact that we who share these beliefs are the majority. And if we fully participate, we can win in huge and transformative ways. So that kind of, remembering change in the past, looking at the power we have now, keeps me kind of hopeful. That and watering my garden and playing with my nieces and nephews.
Well, okay, here's one from Tony from California, who says, you mentioned how Viagra indirectly allowed several different animal species to avoid extinction. I love that. Since you first wrote this book, have there been any other unlikely connections between one seemingly absurd event and a positive outcome as a result?
Oh man, it's hard to think of examples, but I think that's actually not an uncommon phenomenon. Whether it's something that backfires and makes people realize exactly the opposite of what was intended. I can think of a horrible thing is that the massacre in the Black Church in Charleston by Dylann Roof made South Carolina take down its Confederate flags and made a lot of the sort of southern U.S. re-examine its Confederate symbolism. I've spent a lot of time in New Orleans. It's a place I love, as well as a place where I recognize the brutal history of racism. And seeing them take down their Confederate statues that's not funny like Viagra and Caribou, but I think it's a direct consequence
Mm-hmm.
of exactly what Dylan Roof in his he attempted to start a war. He didn't know what the war would look like, which was a war against the poisonousness of the continuing racism that idealizes the South and Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis and the losing side of the Civil War. It's so exciting seeing that stuff come down in New Orleans, even though, again, there's a backlash with that demonstration in Charlottesville that just happened, things like that. So that's one of them. But there's so many that have happened. Attacks on women that have ultimately strengthened women's rights. You can see the sexual harassment of Anita Hill by Clarence Thomas turned, even though it didn't prevent Clarence Thomas, which is from becoming a Supreme Court justice, I suspect it has something to do with the fact he's been largely silent ever since. That she did silence him in a way by telling us the truth about who he is. But it also created public awareness about sexual harassment in 1991 when she testified, that finally got us workplace sexual harassment legislation that fall that still really matters to every working woman's life. And so there's so many examples, and it's following that kind of zigzag of history. I think is a fascinating exercise, and Trump may be the equivalent of Dylan Roof on a grand scale if we make it so.
Wouldn't that be great?
Yeah,
And deserved a great historical
yeah.
comeuppance for him. Um, Here's a funny one from Teresa. I'm sorry. Teresa from Los Angeles says, "You talk a lot about the unhelpfulness of concepts like salvation or an endpoint to struggle because victories are usually temporary. While most of us would see stopping Trump or getting rid of him as a miraculous victory, how can we adjust our expectations in order to properly confront the many other sources of injustice in our society?"
Yeah, and I didn't say that to make people feel like we never win, but there is a fantasy of like, oh, there's one thing that's broken and we'll fix it, and then we can return to being non-participants. It's kind of like I watered my garden once, now it should grow. It's like, no, you got to get out there and water it regularly.
Yeah.
And that Trump is a symptom of something much deeper, and something I've thought about a lot is I do think the majority of people in this country are basically humane, having some enlightenment values about the equality of all people, the value of all lives, the importance of the environment, the importance of truth and sort of factual basis to statements. It's kind of rule of law, ideas about justice and social justice. But we do have, in Trump's followers who don't care how you arrive at your conclusions in places like Fox News, which, have perpetrated a kind of culture of lies about race, lies about sexism, lies about the environment. We do have an entrenched population, and I think we're going to have to find a way to reach out to them. I think our long-term work is going to be reaching out to them and finding a way to tell them stories. And these people are mostly white people who feel like this was their country and now there's all these other people. How do we tell stories that are better than their kind of bitter, exclusionary stories about what this country can be for everyone? How there's enough to go around. We don't have to tell stories about scarcity. And there are specific things you finish forever, like Donald Trump may have an aneurysm tomorrow, and that's the end of Donald Trump. And I think he's portly, doesn't exercise, and is clearly very emotionally volatile. It could happen, but we have a scary, dark money backed, billionaire backed, Fox News and Breitbart backed, right wing, and it's a lot of entrenchment in it, and roots that go back to the Confederacy to some extent. And it feels like this is kind of a time of reckoning. Black Lives Matter was bringing us to face it. Hurricane Katrina, which is what brought me to New Orleans, brought us to face it. And, this anti-Islamic monstrosity is bringing us to face that intolerance. And we have to go a lot deeper than getting rid of Trump to kind of address this kind of festering that's gone on for generations. And so in that sense, we're not necessarily going to finish it. We're not going to live in a world without problems. We can't finish specific problems. We ended slavery in the United States as something that was legally allowed. We ended, we passed the 19th Amendment in 1920 that gave women the right to vote. There are things that we don't have to fight again. And, but we're not gonna go home in the sense of like, okay, that's done, we can go home and stuff. So, but I think there are milestones where you're like, okay, that's over. We're not, the justification for the Iraq War has fallen apart, and we don't have to fight that battle again. Everybody just pretends they never believed that crap, rather than that.
I think that's really common.
Yeah,
that one specifically. I mean, yeah. But let me just go on to another question, which I'm sorry, I don't have the name, so whoever sent this out, my apologies. It says, in the chapter After Ideology or Alterations in Time, you talk about putting the means of a struggle before its ends and about how political power shouldn't be the most important focus of a movement. Yet the far right has been extraordinarily effective at getting power at every level of government in the past years, and have thus been able to set the terms of our political debates and legislative agendas. Shouldn't attaining power be at least one major focus of any mass movement?
I without reading the book while everyone watches, I will just say I don't think that's what I intended to say. Okay. And there's a sense in which, like, if your goal is a more compassionate country, it's kind of hard to get there through a deeply uncompassionate, bullying, exclusionary process. If you're there to have racial justice, a group in which only white guys talk is not necessarily going to build the best racial justice movement. And it hasn't, whereas if you have a process, you have these little victories, like if you're achieving racial justice or inclusivity or compassion in your process. I think the right has been brilliant at power building, and it's partly sheer tenacity and long-term vision. Let's take over the school board. Let's win the state legislature so we can gerrymander, so we can win a majority in Congress with a minority of votes, which is they've done. And but I think that you can pursue power while being a decent human being. And you look at something, the nakedness of their decision to disenfranchise people of color. There's no way you can't be essentially evil, cynical, a person who doesn't believe in equality, who's out specifically to destroy rights of people who have every right to full participation. It's a road to power. It might not be a road to long-term power. And I think that actually power is more stable when it's built on, the majority participation, on democracy, on transparency, on honesty, so that you're not promulgating lies that are going to fall apart if somebody does a good expose on you. You're not going to get caught doing things you don't want to do. And we've seen a lot of Republicans fall, like Tom DeLay, the old Speaker of the House.
My former representative.
Yeah. Yeah. Did I call him a senator? Or
no, representative. But yeah.
Yeah. But we've seen a lot of Republicans fall through, and Democrats as well. But we've seen people corrupt themselves to get power and then fall through that power. Newt Gingrich, who's now hovering as a kind of evil troll cheerleader for the Trump administration. I think the Trump administration may fall through corruption, and Michael Flynn already has. And corruption may bring them all, like if we can have due process, which civil society pressure may be able to ensure, we may be able to bring them all down.
Well,
and that's kind of...
let's hope so. I have another question that maybe isn't a great way to end, but because it's a little bit depressing and it goes against really everything you've said. Someone anonymous from Missouri says, How do I plan for a future I don't think exists?
Multiple futures exist and we make them.
Yeah.
Because it's really, there's a way people talk about what's going to happen as though, it's a kind of peasant fatalism. It's already been decided what's going to happen. All I can do is adapt to it, whatever. And that renders our participation futile.
It's very anti-democratic, isn't it?
What?
It's pretty anti-democratic, ultimately.
Well, and also, it says we have no power,
Right.
and that's how I mean, in a way, questions like that give me an opportunity to get back to the essence of what Hope in the Dark is about. We don't know what will happen. Optimists say everything will be fine no matter what, and so they get us off the hook from having to do anything. Pessimists also say that whatever happens doesn't depend on us. That, and it basically says everything's going to suck no matter what. And we're doomed. It's all terrible. We have, but both of them, are, to me, are dismal in that they say we have that the future's already been decided, and we do not participate in making that future. They take away the uncertainty. I totally empathize with how dismal things can be and have been in Missouri at times in the recent past. But I also think, and that's where a lot of the key work for Black Lives Matter happened in Ferguson and St. Louis. Sarah Kendzior, one of the great critiques of the Trump regime, is based in St. Louis. There's a lot of beautiful heartland organizing, a lot of extraordinary and visionary people. And actually, the thing I think of Missouri is, oh my God, maybe I shouldn't go into the historical digression about when the city of St. Louis was run as a people's commune like the Paris Commune in 1877. But I love that story. There's been a lot of Missouris.
Okay.
And, but I think, we don't know what's going to happen. We're now, with the instability we face, they're going to try and do a lot of terrible things. I don't think they're that powerful. I think there's a certain amount of Bundy and the Malheur Wildlife Refuge quality to them.
I love it.
And that has made so much sense to me, since you just saw like these kind of like nasty boys club hold up, thinking like, we're going to do what we're going to do and you can't stop us. And it's like, you can do whatever you want in the White House, but if you give an order, the Ninth Circuit or one of their circuit courts might take it out. Oh, there goes my cell phone.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Rebecca.
Just ignore it.
Yeah, just ignore it. We're a ragtag liberal
at least
organization.
It's just like Big Ben tolling hours in London.
I'll tell everybody that. But this was really just so great and inspiring, and actually, I'm walking away from it feeling better than I have from any of the other events we've done, and we've had some great people. And now, as is our tradition, even though this is our only third event, it already feels like a tradition. We announced the next Daily Action Book Club pick, and that is going to be Timothy Snyder's On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. Tim Snyder has a whole lot to say about why we should study the lessons of past disasters. You've talked a lot about past triumphs as well, in order to prevent the death of democracy and the emergence of dictatorial rule as it happened in the 20th century. So please remember, if you buy On Tyranny through our partners, McNally Jackson in New York or online, a part of your purchase will go to support Daily Action. So Timothy Snyder will be joining us on June 12th at 7 p.m. Eastern to discuss. So, Rebecca Solnit, thank you so very, very much for joining us. This has just been really inspirational. And to our members, we will see you on June 12th. So, good night.
Thank you. And just one more thing to say, which is I'm grateful for everyone who's still listening. And I just want to say, they would like you to feel helpless and hopeless. That's a gift you don't have to give them. Don't surrender.
Thanks, Rebecca.
You're welcome. Take care. Pleasure.